Blood washes out of Italian cotton if you use cold water and a cheap bar of lye soap. Vivian learned that when she was 11. Eleanor learned it at 18, trembling over a chemistry textbook smeared with rust-colored fingerprints. She was supposed to inherit the most ruthless criminal syndicate in Boston. But she couldn't pass organic chemistry. Vivian was supposed to scrub her floors. But she was the only one who realized the heir to the Moretti family was completely, hopelessly dyslexic. Midnight in the Moretti estate always smelled like lemon polish and stale cigar smoke. Vivian Hayes dragged a rag across the oak wainscoting of the primary library. The repetitive squeak rub sound was the only noise in the cavernous room. Her knees ached. The damp linoleum of the kitchen had seeped into her jeans hours ago. But her mother's arthritis was acting up again. Martha was asleep in the servants' quarters over the garage, wrapped in a heating pad, leaving Vivian to finish the third-floor dusting. At the far end of the room, anchored behind a mahogany desk the size of a dining table, sat Eleanor Moretti. She wasn't a princess. Vivian hated the way the girls at St. Jude's Preparatory whispered about her, like she was some dark, tragic royalty. To Vivian, she was just the boss's kid. An 18-year-old with bruised knuckles, a custom-tailored suit she wore like a straitjacket, and a temper that cost Vivian's mother hours of cleaning up shattered glass. Tonight, there was no glass breaking. There was only a heavy, suffocating silence punctuated by the frantic scratching of a graphite pencil. Vivian paused her rag. She watched Eleanor from the periphery of her vision. Eleanor was hunched over a thick textbook, her broad shoulders pulled up to her ears. Her left hand was buried in her dark hair, gripping the roots tight enough to pull them out. She was staring at a piece of paper as if trying to set it on fire with her mind. Snap! The pencil broke. Yellow splinters shot across the polished wood. Eleanor didn't curse. She didn't yell. She just dropped her forehead against the heavy wood of the desk with a dull, hollow thud. Her breath hitched with a wet, jagged sound that didn't belong in this house. Alphas in the Moretti family didn't gasp. They didn't panic. They certainly didn't cry. Vivian squeezed the lemon-scented rag in her hands until her raw knuckles turned white. She should walk away. It was the first rule of survival in the Moretti household. Be furniture. Furniture doesn't see. Furniture doesn't hear. But she saw the crumpled piece of paper shoved to the corner of the desk. The red ink bled through the expensive parchment. It was a midterm exam. The number at the top was a 38. Carmine Moretti, Eleanor's father, didn't tolerate 38 seconds. Carmine was an alpha who measured worth in absolute numbers, profit margins, bullet counts, loyalty percentages. If his only daughter and heir couldn't conquer a high school chemistry class, Carmine wouldn't see a teenager struggling. He would see a liability. And the Moretti family disposed of liabilities. Eleanor picked up the broken half of the pencil. Her hand was shaking so violently the graphite rattled against the desk. She was trying to force herself to write. She was trying to brute force her way through a brain that wouldn't cooperate. Vivian dropped her rag into the tin bucket at her feet. The water sloshed loud in the quiet room. Eleanor's head snapped up. Her eyes, usually a flat, deadened gray, were bloodshot and wide with cornered animal panic. She shoved the exam under a leather blotter in a single jerky motion. What are you doing here? Her voice was gravelly, defensive. It sounded like a threat. But Vivian could hear the tremor beneath it. Dusting, Vivian said, her voice flat. She wiped her damp hands on her jeans. Get out. I need quiet. It's pretty quiet, Vivian pointed out, taking a step closer instead of retreating. The plush Persian rug absorbed the sound of her cheap sneakers. Except for you breaking things. I told you to leave, Vivian. Eleanor pushed her chair back. The leather squeaked. She was trying to look imposing, squaring her shoulders, projecting the aura of the violent, untouchable alpha heir. It usually worked. It worked on the teachers, the rival families, the cops on the payroll. It didn't work on the Omega who washed her blood out of her shirts. Vivian walked straight up to the desk. The smell of Eleanor's cologne, expensive cedar and sharp peppermint, mixed with the sour scent of her nervous sweat. She didn't look at Eleanor. She looked down at the textbook. The page was a wall of black text, dense and unyielding. I can't read it, Eleanor whispered suddenly. The confession spilled out of her like blood from an unbandaged wound. She looked horrified the second the words left her mouth, her jaw clenching tight. I read the same paragraph 10 times. It doesn't stay still. The letters swap. The numbers flip. It's a goddamn joke. She waited for Vivian to laugh. Or pity her. Or run to tell the other staff. Vivian did none of those things. She reached into the front pocket of her faded flannel shirt and pulled out a piece of translucent blue plastic. It was a cheap divider she had ripped out of a clearance bin binder 3 years ago. She slapped it flat onto the open page of the chemistry textbook. Look at it now, she commanded. Eleanor stared at her, her jaw tight. What the hell is this? Just read the top line through the plastic. Stop arguing. Eleanor glared at her, her chest heaving with lingering panic. But she dropped her gaze to the book. The harsh, blinding white of the glossy paper was muted by the deep blue. The stark contrast of the black letters softened. The glare died. Vivian watched Eleanor's eyes. For the past 20 minutes they had been darting erratically, refusing to track in a straight line. Now they locked onto the first word. They moved to the second, the third, smoothly. The tension in Eleanor's shoulders didn't evaporate. This wasn't a magic trick. But it shifted. The frantic, cornered energy settled into a heavy, confused stillness. The fundamental principle of covalent bonding, Eleanor read aloud, her voice low, is the sharing of electron pairs between atoms. She stopped. She blinked hard and looked up at Vivian. They aren't moving. The white space on the page creates glare. Your brain is trying to process the negative space instead of the letters. The plastic cuts the contrast, Vivian said, her tone clinical. My little brother had it. Dyslexia. Schizophrenic sensitivity, whatever you want to call it. He used to say the letters looked like bugs crawling on the page. I don't have a disease. Eleanor's defensive instincts flared instantly. She shoved the blue plastic away. I'm just tired, okay? Vivian picked up the plastic and slipped it back into her pocket. She turned around and walked back to her bucket. She picked up her rag. Wait, Eleanor said. Vivian didn't stop wringing out the rag. The lemon water splashed into the tin. Wait for what? You're tired. I'm dusting. We're doing our jobs. Give it back. No. Vivian turned to face her, leaning her hip against the heavy oak paneling. Because if I give it to you, you'll hide it. You'll use it when no one's looking. But you won't know how to use it properly. You don't just need a piece of plastic, Eleanor. You don't know how to break down equations. You're memorizing shapes instead of understanding concepts. I saw your math homework in the trash last week. Eleanor stood up. She crossed the distance between them in 3 long strides. She was a foot taller than Vivian, built like a middleweight boxer, all dense muscle and coiled aggression. She backed Vivian against the wainscoting, her hands slamming into the wood on either side of Vivian's head. "You went through my trash?" Her voice was a lethal whisper. Vivian didn't flinch. She looked at the pulse beating frantically at the base of Eleanor's throat. "I empty your trash. It's my job. And you didn't shred it. If you tell my father." "If I tell your father, he'll think you're defective." Vivian interrupted, her voice devoid of fear. She was too tired to be intimidated by an alpha whose laundry she folded. "He'll pull you out of St. Jude's. He'll put your cousin Dante in line for the seat. And then what happens to you, Eleanor? You become an enforcer. A grunt. You'll be dead in an alley by 22. Eleanor's breath washed over Vivian's face. She smelled like peppermint and despair. Her gray eyes searched Vivian's, looking for a bluff, looking for leverage. She found nothing but exhausted, cynical honesty. "Why do you care?" Eleanor asked, the thread in her posture deflating slightly. "I don't." Vivian lied smoothly. "But if you fail out, your father will be in a foul mood. When he's in a foul mood, he fires staff. If my mother gets fired, she loses her health insurance. We lose the apartment over the garage. I'm not going homeless because you're too proud to admit you can't read a pie chart." It was a transactional truth. The only kind of truth the Mafia understood. Eleanor slowly lowered her arms. She stepped back, running a hand over her face, smearing a streak of graphite across her cheekbone. She looked suddenly incredibly young, and entirely broken. "The final is next Thursday," she muttered, staring at the floor. "I need a 90 to pass the class for the semester. I have a 38. Vivian walked back to the desk. She pulled the blue plastic from her pocket and dropped it on the open textbook. "Sit down," she said. "We start with the vocabulary. And we don't write. We build." The arrangement became a ritual of shadows and silence. Every night at 1 a.m., Vivian would carry her cleaning caddy to the third-floor library. She would lock the heavy double doors. Eleanor would be waiting, surrounded by textbooks she viewed as bear traps. They didn't study like normal teenagers. Flashcards were useless. Highlighted notes were just brightly colored noise. Vivian tore the curriculum down to its studs and rebuilt it in the physical world. She used a deck of heavy casino playing cards to teach probability and statistics. She used silver $50 and copper pennies to map out chemical reactions, physically sliding the metal across the desk to show electron transfer and molecular bonding. When they tackled biology, she made Eleanor pace the length of the room, assigning different corners to different systems, forcing her spatial memory to anchor the cellular processes her brain couldn't process on paper. It was growling. It was ugly. Sometimes Eleanor would get so frustrated she would sweep the coins off the desk, sending them crashing into the shelves. Vivian would simply cross her arms and wait until her breathing slowed, then point to the floor until she picked every single one up. But it was working. By the third night, the frantic panic in Eleanor's eyes was replaced by a grim, exhausted focus. She was learning how her own brain functioned. She stopped trying to read sentences whole. She used the blue plastic to isolate words, tracing them with her finger, reading aloud in a low murmur to engage her auditory processing. It was 2:30 a.m. on a Tuesday when the heavy brass handle of the library doors rattled. Vivian froze, a stack of poker chips halfway to the table. Eleanor stiffened, the color draining from her face so fast she looked corpse-like. "Unlock it." A voice boomed from the hallway. "Carmine Moretti." Vivian moved purely on instinct. She swept the poker chips and the blue plastic overlay off the desk, dumping them into the soapy water of her cleaning bucket. She shoved the textbook under a stack of meaningless financial ledgers. In 2 seconds she was on her hands and knees by the fireplace, scrubbing furiously at a non-existent soot stain on the marble hearth. Eleanor grabbed a pen, pulled a random ledger toward her, and arranged her face into a mask of bored concentration. A key turned in the lock. The double doors swung open, hitting the rubber stops with a heavy thud. Carmine stepped into the room. He was a massive alpha, imposing even in a silk dressing gown. He carried the scent of wintergreen mints and gun oil, a chilling combination Vivian had learned to associate with the days men went missing from the neighborhood. "Why is this door locked?" Carmine demanded, his voice a low rumbling earthquake. "Draft from the hallway was blowing the papers," Eleanor said, her voice steady. It was the voice of the air, cold, detached. Vivian kept her head down, her brush moving in tight, rhythmic circles. "Scrub, scrub, scrub. Don't look at the predator." Carmine strolled slowly towards the desk, his leather slippers making no sound. He stopped behind Eleanor, resting his heavy, calloused hands on his daughter's shoulders. Vivian saw Eleanor's knuckles turn white where she gripped the pen. But she didn't flinch. "Working late?" Carmine observed, his eyes scanning the desk. He didn't look at Vivian. She was a fixture. A mop with a heartbeat. Reviewing the quarterly distributions, Eleanor lied smoothly, tapping the ledger. "The numbers from the Southside docks look light." Carmine hummed, a sound of vague approval. He squeezed Eleanor's shoulder. It wasn't an affectionate gesture. It was an assessment of muscle density. A check for weakness. "Good," Carmine said. The school called today. The temperature in the room plummeted. Vivian's brush caught on the grout. She forced herself to keep moving it. "Headmaster says you've been skipping the study halls," Carmine continued, his fingers digging into Eleanor's trapezius muscle. "Says your chemistry grade is a concern." "The headmaster is a nervous old woman," Eleanor said, her tone dripping with practiced arrogance. "I'm handling it. The final is Thursday. I'll ace it." "You better," Carmine whispered, leaning down so his mouth was near Eleanor's ear. "You know how I feel about failure, Eleanor. We don't employ stupid alphas. And we certainly don't let them run the family. Don't embarrass me." "I won't." Carmine patted Eleanor's cheek, 2 sharp, stinging slaps. Then he turned and walked out. The doors clicked shut behind him. For 10 seconds, neither Vivian nor Eleanor moved. Then Eleanor dropped the pen. She leaned over the side of the desk, grabbed the brass wastebasket, and violently threw up. Vivian didn't say a word. She stood, went to the small wet bar in the corner, and poured a glass of cold water. She brought it to Eleanor, setting it quietly on the desk next to the ruined wastebasket. Eleanor sat back, wiping her mouth with the back of her trembling hand. She looked at the water. Then she looked at Vivian. The mask of the ruthless alpha heir was entirely gone. Stripped away by pure visceral terror. "He'll kill me," Eleanor rasped, her voice breaking. "If I fail. He won't literally kill me. But he'll exile me. He'll strip the name. I'll be nothing." Vivian looked at the girl, not the boss's daughter. Just a terrified alpha trapped in a cage made of money and violence. She reached into her soapy bucket, her fingers fishing through the cold water until she found a red poker chip. She pulled it out, wiped it on her jeans, and set it on the desk with a sharp clack. "Then you don't fail," Vivian said, her voice dropping the cynical edge, leaving only a fierce, stubborn gravity. "We have 48 hours until the final. We're going to map out the entire periodic table using these chips. And you are going to memorize the physical weight of every single electron configuration. She pushed the glass closer. Drink your water. We aren't done. Eleanor stared at the red chip. Slowly, she reached out and touched it. Her breathing leveled out. She picked up the glass of water, drank it in one long swallow, and nodded. Okay, she said quietly. Show me. Chalk dust and scorched radiator heat made the air in Mr. Harrison's classroom thick enough to choke on. Eleanor sat in the third row, her knees pressed tight together to keep her leg from bouncing. The St. Jude's preparatory uniform, navy blazer, striped tie, worsted wool trousers, felt like a layer of fiberglass against her skin. Around her, the soft synchronized ch of turning pages sounded like knives sharpening on a whetstone. Mr. Harrison walked down the aisle, dropping a 12-page packet upside down on Eleanor's desk. It landed with a dull, heavy slap. Final examination. Organic chemistry. Eleanor didn't flip it over immediately. She closed her eyes. She breathed in the smell of number 2 graphite and floor wax. She felt the cold sweat pooling at the base of her spine. If she flipped this packet over and the letters started swimming, it was over. Her father wouldn't just pull her from school. Carmine would drag her down to the meatpacking plant on the south side and put a ledger in her hand. When Eleanor inevitably failed to balance it, Carmine would hand her a gun instead. You become an enforcer. A grunt. You'll be dead in an alley by 22. Vivian's voice echoed in her head. Cold and pragmatic. Eleanor opened her eyes. She reached into her blazer pocket and pulled out a cheap, translucent blue plastic ruler. Vivian had bought it for 99 cents at a corner pharmacy. It's not a disability aid. It's a geometry tool. If anyone asks, you're underlining. Keep it moving down the page. She flipped the packet. The harsh white glare of the fluorescent lights hit the glossy paper. The black text immediately began to vibrate, the edges of the paragraphs blurring into a solid block of meaningless ink. Panic, sharp and metallic, flared in the back of her throat. Eleanor forced her hand to move. She laid the blue ruler flat across the first question. The glare died. The letters stopped humming. Question 1. Explain the mechanism of nucleophilic substitution in alkyl halides. She didn't try to read the words as a sentence. She looked at the shapes through the blue tint. Nucleophilic. Substitution. Alkyl. Halides. She closed her eyes again, not in panic this time, but in concentration. She didn't see the classroom. She saw the mahogany desk in her father's library. She saw the silver $50 stacked on the left, the copper pennies pushed to the right. She remembered Vivian sliding a stack of pennies across the oak grain, her voice dry and tired. Think of electrons like currency. They move where they're needed. The molecule with the most stable configuration wins. Eleanor picked up her pencil. She began to write. It wasn't elegant. Her handwriting was a jagged, aggressive scrawl, the letters pressed so hard into the paper they left physical grooves on the back of the page. She didn't use the academic jargon the textbook demanded. She used the language of the poker chips. She explained electron sharing like she was explaining a rigged card game. She broke down reaction pathways by visualizing the shipping routes Carmine controlled out of the Boston ports. 45 minutes later, her hand was cramping so violently her fingers were locked into a claw. The blue ruler was smudged with her nervous sweat. But the blank lines were filled. Across the campus, in the humid, bleach-scented basement of the athletic center, Vivian dragged a damp mop across the locker room tiles. She wasn't a student at St. Jude's. She wore a gray poly blend uniform, her hair tied back in a severe bun that pulled at her scalp. The school outsourced its janitorial staff through a shell company Carmine Moretti owned. It was a neat, tax-deductible way to keep the families of his lower-tier employees indebted to him. Vivian leaned her weight against the mop handle, her shoulders screaming in protest. She stared at the industrial wall clock above the towel bins. 11:45 a.m. The final was over. She shouldn't care. It was a dangerous, stupid thing to care about the boss's daughter. Empathy in her world was a liability. Just like failure was in Eleanor's. But for the last week, she had sat in the quiet dark of the library and watched an alpha tear herself apart trying to fit into a mold that was actively killing her. She had seen the raw, unpolished desperation beneath the custom tailoring. She had seen her bleeding out in red ink. Vivian plunged the mop into the rolling yellow bucket, wringing it out with a violent twist of the lever. If Eleanor failed, Carmine would erupt. The fallout would trickle down, it always did. The capos would get yelled at, the soldiers would get hit, the maids would get fired. Simple trickle-down economics. The very thing Eleanor was being tested on. A heavy, sickening knot tightened in Vivian's stomach. She told herself it was just anxiety over her mother's job. She told herself the sudden sharp image of Eleanor's terrified gray eyes meant absolutely nothing. Friday afternoon tasted like copper and impending doom. The Moretti estate was unnervingly quiet. Carmine was out of the sit-down with the unions, leaving the sprawling mansion echoing and empty. Vivian was in the basement laundry room, surrounded by the deafening hum of 3 industrial dryers. The air was thick with the suffocating scent of hot cotton and lavender fabric softener. She was folding a stack of thick white towels, her hands moving in practiced robotic motions, when the heavy fire door banged open. Vivian jumped, dropping a towel onto the folding table. Eleanor stood in the doorway. She looked entirely unhinged. Her tie was yanked down, her top button undone, her dark hair a tangled mess standing up at odd angles where she had been running her hands through it. She was breathing hard, her chest heaving under the wrinkled cotton of her dress shirt. She didn't say a word. She just closed the heavy metal door behind her, locking out the rest of the house. The click of the deadbolt sounded like a gunshot over the hum of the dryers. Vivian's heart slammed against her ribs. She took a step back, her spine pressing against the vibrating metal of a washing machine. Be furniture, her instincts screamed. Look away. But Eleanor wasn't looking at her like she was a maid. She crossed the concrete floor in 3 long strides, her heavy leather shoes silent against the noise of the room. She stopped bare inches from Vivian, entirely invading her space. The heat radiating off her mixed with the humid air of the laundry room. She smelled like cedar, sweat, and sheer unfiltered adrenaline. She thrust a crumpled piece of paper into the space between them. Vivian looked down. Her eyes struggled to focus on the jagged handwriting. At the top of the page, circled heavily in red ink, was a number. 91. Vivian stopped breathing. She stared at the 9 and the 1. The red ink didn't look like blood today. It looked like a lifeline. I passed. Eleanor's voice was a ragged whisper, completely stripped of its usual arrogant drawl. She sounded like a drowning woman who had just touched solid ground. I passed the class. Vivian looked up from the paper. Her eyes met Eleanor's. The flat, deadened gray was gone, replaced by a chaotic, burning intensity. She wasn't smiling. The relief was too heavy, too profound for a smile. You didn't just pass, Vivian said, her voice unsteady. She cleared her throat, trying to summon back her cynical armor. You got a 91. You missed an A by 2 points. I missed an A because I couldn't read the last question, Eleanor admitted, the words spilling out without hesitation. She wasn't guarding her weakness anymore. Not with Vivian. The ruler slipped. The letters scrambled. I ran out of time. But I got the 91. She stepped closer. The toes of her shoes bumped against Vivian's cheap sneakers. You did it, Vivian said quietly. You memorized the chips. No. Eleanor's gaze dropped to Vivian's mouth for a fraction of a second before snapping back to her eyes. We did it. Without thinking, Eleanor reached out. Her hand, heavy and rough, calloused from years of boxing, closed over Vivian's shoulder. It wasn't a violent grip. It was a desperate, grounding anchor. Her thumb brushed against the cheap collar of Vivian's gray uniform. Vivian froze. Every muscle in her body locked tight. Omegas did not touch the Moretti family. The Moretti family did not touch Omegas. If Carmine walked in, if any of the capos saw them, the 91 wouldn't matter. Eleanor would be disciplined. Vivian and her mother would be erased. She should pull away. She should step sideways, pick up the towel, and remind Eleanor of the chasm between them. Instead, she looked at the dark smudges of exhaustion under Eleanor's eyes. She felt the slight tremor in her hand, the residual vibration of terror finally leaving her body. And for 5 seconds, standing in the suffocating heat of the basement, Vivian didn't pull away. She let out a long, shaky breath, the tension draining out of her own shoulders, sagging slightly into Eleanor's grip. It was a truce. A quiet, dangerous acknowledgement that they had survived the week. Well, Vivian whispered, her voice barely carrying over the dryers, at least I don't have to pack my bags yet. A sound caught in Eleanor's throat, a startling, rusty noise that might have been a laugh. The corner of her mouth twitched upward. She looked down at Vivian, the distance between them suddenly feeling entirely too small. Her eyes darkened. The adrenaline shifted into something heavier. Something pulling her closer. Clack. The distinct sound of a leather-soled shoe hitting the concrete stairwell echoed from the hallway outside. Eleanor let go of Vivian as if she had caught fire. She took 2 massive steps backward, her face instantly hardening into a mask of cold indifference. The chaotic human girl vanished, replaced by the lethal alpha air. Vivian whipped around, snatching the towel off the table and snapping it open with a sharp crack, burying her shaking hands in the white terry cloth. The fire door swung open. Dante Moretti stood in the doorway. He was 21, built like a fire hydrant, with slicked back hair and eyes that constantly scanned rooms for weakness. He was Carmine's nephew, and he wanted Eleanor's inheritance with a vicious, barely concealed hunger. Dante leaned against the doorframe, a lit cigarette dangling from his lips, ignoring the strict no-smoking rule in the basement. His gaze flicked from Eleanor, who was adjusting her cuffs with bored precision, to Vivian, who was aggressively folding a towel she had already folded. Well, Dante sneered, his voice a slick, oily baritone. What's the young princess doing down in the dungeons? Lose your way from the West Wing, Eleanor? Looking for my dry cleaning, Eleanor said flatly, shoving the crumpled test paper deep into her trouser pocket. Idiot cleaners lost my black silk shirt. Dante took a drag of his cigarette. He didn't look convinced. His eyes drifted to Vivian, assessing, cataloging. She helping you find it? A nasty implication hung on the words. She's deaf and dumb as far as I'm concerned, Eleanor said, her voice dripping with venomous disdain. It was perfect. It was exactly how a Moretti was supposed to talk about the help. Useless. I'm going upstairs. Eleanor walked past her cousin, her shoulder purposely clipping Dante's as she exited the room. Dante stayed in the doorway for a long moment. He flicked a clump of gray ash onto the freshly mopped concrete floor. He looked at Vivian, a slow, predatory smirk spreading across his face. "She's a volatile one, isn't she, sweetheart?" Dante murmured. "Better watch your step around her. Things break when Eleanor gets frustrated." He turned and followed Eleanor up the stairs. Vivian stood alone in the deafening noise of the laundry room. She stared at the gray ash staining the clean floor. She lifted her hand and touched her own shoulder, right where Eleanor's thumb had brushed her collar. Her skin was burning. Frost coated the rim of the industrial kitchen dumpster like crushed glass. It was Tuesday, 3 days after the final, and the Boston wind was slicing through the alley with a bitter, damp bite. Vivian heaved a black trash bag over the metal lip. It hit the bottom with a wet, heavy thud. She stepped back, burying her raw hands deep into the pockets of her oversized denim jacket, shivering as the stench of rotting coffee grounds and sour bleach hit the freezing air. "You should wear gloves." Vivian spun around, her boots sliding on a patch of black ice. Eleanor stood in the shadows of the brick overhang. She was wearing a charcoal wool overcoat that probably cost more than Vivian's mother's annual salary, the collar turned up against the wind. A glowing cigarette ember hung between her fingers. She looked like she belonged on a movie poster, but her posture was all wrong. Stiff, hovering, strangely uncertain. "You scared the hell out of me," Vivian snapped. Her heart was hammering against her ribs, a Pavlovian response to seeing a Moretti in the dark. Eleanor didn't apologize. Apologies weren't in her vocabulary. She took a drag of her cigarette, exhaled a thick cloud of white smoke into the freezing night, and stepped out of the shadows. "I've been waiting out here for 20 minutes, she said, her voice rough. "Why? Did you forget how doors work?" Eleanor ignored the sarcasm. She reached into her overcoat pocket and pulled out a thick white envelope. She held it out to Vivian. The wind caught the edge of the paper, making it flutter. Vivian looked at the envelope. She didn't move her hands from her pockets. "What is that?" "It's $5,000, Eleanor said, casually, the same way someone else might say it's a cup of coffee. "In hundreds. Untraceable." Vivian stared at the white rectangle. The ambient light from the kitchen windows painted a dull yellow streak across the snow between them. "Why are you giving me $5,000? Her voice was completely flat. Eleanor shifted her weight, looking suddenly irritated that Vivian wasn't snatching it from her grip. "Because you saved my ass. My father saw the final grade. He bought me a new Rolex and gave me control of the Southside collections for the month. It's my cut. I'm giving you a cut. I don't want a cut." "Don't be stupid, Vivian." Eleanor's tone sharpened into the arrogant alpha air Vivian usually dealt with. She stepped closer, shoving the envelope toward Vivian's chest. "Your boots have holes in them. Your mother is chewing ibuprofen like candy because she can't afford the physical therapy copay. Take the damn money." Vivian finally pulled her hands out of her pockets. She didn't take the envelope. She pushed Eleanor's hand away, her palm slapping against the cold wool of her sleeve. "Keep your hush money, Eleanor." Eleanor's jaw tightened. "It's not hush money. It's a thank you. In your world, there's no difference." Vivian shot back, her voice rising over the wind. She stepped into Eleanor's space, tilting her head up to glare at her. "You give envelopes of cash to the beat cops so they look the other way. You give cash to the union bosses so they shut up. You give cash to the girls you want to leave out the back door before breakfast. If I take that envelope, I'm bought. I'm on your payroll. And when your father finds out, because he finds out everything, he won't see an Omega who helped you study. He'll see an extortionist. Eleanor stared down at her. The glowing cherry of her cigarette burned close to her knuckles, but she didn't seem to feel it. I wouldn't let him touch you, she said. The words came out low, dangerous, and entirely instinctual. Vivian let out a harsh, bitter laugh. You can't even read a menu without breaking into a cold sweat, Eleanor. Don't play the mob boss with me. You can't protect me from Carmine. You can barely protect yourself. The truth landed between them like a physical blow. Eleanor flinched. The arrogant mask shattered, leaving behind that raw, desperate alpha from the library. She looked down at the thick envelope in her hand, suddenly realizing how grotesque it was. She had tried to quantify Vivian. She had tried to pay off the only person who had looked at her and seen a human being instead of a weapon. She slowly lowered her hand, slipping the envelope back into her coat pocket. I don't know how to do this, Eleanor admitted, the gravel in her voice scraping against the quiet alley. She dropped her cigarette and crushed it beneath her leather heel. Nobody in this house does anything for free. You gave me the one thing I needed to survive him. And you didn't ask for anything. I don't have a file for that. Vivian watched the tension humming in Eleanor's shoulders. She was an alpha raised in a shark tank, completely bewildered by a hand that reached in to pull her up instead of drag her under. You want to thank me? Vivian asked softly. Eleanor looked up, her gray eyes locking onto Vivian's. Yes. Pass the final next month, Vivian said. She turned around, grabbing the handle of the empty dumpster. And stop throwing your math homework in the trash. The blue plastic only works if you actually use it. She walked back toward the heavy metal door of the kitchen. She didn't look back. She didn't need to. She could feel Eleanor's eyes on her spine, heavy and burning, all the way until the door clicked shut. Sunday dinners at the Moretti estate tasted like veal marsala and unspoken threats. The dining room was a suffocating display of wealth. Heavy velvet curtains blocked out the Boston skyline, trapping the heat of the roaring fireplace and the cloying scent of garlic, roasting meats, and Carmine's expensive cologne. 15 men sat around the 30-foot mahogany table, capos, lieutenants, and family. Vivian stood in the corner, her back perfectly straight, holding a silver tray with a crystal pitcher of ice water. The stiff, starched collar of her serving uniform dug into her neck. B furniture. She watched the table through lowered eyelashes. Carmine sat at the head, holding court, dissecting a piece of veal with surgical precision. Eleanor sat to his right. She was wearing a black suit, her face an impenetrable mask of boredom. She was doing exactly what she was trained to do, projecting dominance. Directly across from Eleanor sat Dante. He hadn't stopped looking at Eleanor all evening. Every time she took a sip of wine, every time she nodded at a capo's joke, Dante's eyes were there, calculating, probing, searching for the crack he had sensed in the laundry room. Pass the salt, Eleanor, Dante said suddenly, cutting through a conversation about port tariffs. Eleanor picked up the silver shaker and slid it across the polished wood. Dante caught it. He sprinkled it over his food, his eyes flicking up to the corner where Vivian stood. A slow, greasy smile spread across his face. Hey, sweetheart. Dante called out, snapping his fingers. The sharp sound cracked like a whip over the low murmur of the table. My glass is empty. Vivian stiffened. She stepped forward, her cheap shoes silent on the Persian rug. She approached Dante's right side, lifting a heavy bottle of Barolo red wine. Just fill it to the brim, Dante murmured, leaning back in his chair. Vivian tipped the bottle. The dark red liquid poured smoothly into the crystal goblet. Just as the wine reached the halfway point, Dante intentionally jerked his elbow backward. His arm slammed into Vivian's wrist. The bottle tipped wildly. A splash of dark red wine sloshed over the rim of the glass, landing squarely on the pristine white cuff of Dante's custom dress shirt, splattering across the fine linen tablecloth like fresh blood. The table went dead silent. 15 hardened criminals stopped chewing. Carmine slowly set down his knife. The clink of silver against china echoed like a gunshot. "Look what you did, you stupid Omega," Dante hissed, his voice loud enough for the entire room to hear. He grabbed his ruined cuff, glaring up at Vivian. Vivian froze. The heavy bottle was suspended in her shaking hand. Panic clawed at her throat. This was the moment. This was how people disappeared. A spilled drink. A bruised ego. A quiet order given in the hallway. "I apologize, sir," Vivian whispered, her voice trembling. She grabbed a white linen napkin from her apron and reached down to blot the spill. Dante violently swatted her hand away. "Don't touch me with your dirty hands." He leaned in closer, dropping his voice just enough so only she and the men immediately next to them could hear. "I know how much you like doing laundry in the dark. But you aren't touching my clothes." At the head of the table, Carmine's eyes narrowed. He looked at Vivian, assessing her the way he would assess a broken chair before throwing it in the fire. "Get out of here," Carmine rumbled, his voice low and dangerous. "Send Martha to clean this up. You're done for the night." Vivian took a step back, her chest tight with terror. She clutched the wine bottle to her chest. She didn't look at Eleanor. She knew better. If she looked at her, she would sign both of their death warrants. But across the table, Eleanor's mask was slipping. She was staring at Dante, her jaw locked so tight the muscle fluttered erratically. Her right hand was wrapped around her crystal water glass. She wasn't breathing. The air around her seemed to warp with a sudden, suffocating violence. She knew exactly what Dante was doing. Dante was testing her. Dante was waiting for the princess to leap up and defend the Omega Maid. If Eleanor spoke, she confirmed Dante's suspicion. If she defended Vivian, Carmine would instantly see a weakness, a bizarre attachment to a servant that could be exploited. "Don't do it," Vivian prayed silently, staring at the floor. "Just let me leave. Don't do anything." Dante smirked at Eleanor across the spilled wine. "Hard to find good help these days, right, Eleanor? So clumsy." Eleanor's eyes were pitch black. She didn't speak. She didn't blink. She just stared at her cousin, channeling every ounce of her suppressed feral rage into her right hand. Crack. The sound was sharp, brittle, and shocking. Everyone at the table jumped. Carmine's head snapped toward his daughter. Eleanor sat perfectly still. The crystal water glass in her right hand had shattered under the sheer, ungodly pressure of her grip. Jagged shards of thick glass protruded from her palm. Ice water flooded across her plate, mixing with the dark, heavy droplets of blood that were already pattering onto the white tablecloth. Drip. 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 She hadn't flinched. She didn't even look at her hand. She kept her dead, empty eyes locked directly on Dante. "Jesus Christ, Eleanor!" Carmine barked, the spilled wine instantly forgotten. The sight of his heir bleeding snapped his paternal instincts, twisted as they were, into focus. "What the hell is wrong with you?" Eleanor finally blinked. She slowly opened her hand. Bloody shards of crystal cascaded onto the table, clinking against the china. "Glass was defective," Eleanor said, her voice a terrifyingly calm monotone. She looked at her ruined, bleeding palm as if it belonged to someone else. Slipped. Dante's smirk had completely vanished. He stared at the blood pooling around Eleanor's plate, his face pale. He recognized the look in his cousin's eyes. It wasn't the look of an alpha protecting an omega. It was the look of an apex predator promising a violent, messy death. "Go to the kitchen," Carmine commanded, waving a hand in disgust. "Get it stitched. You're bleeding on the carpet." Eleanor stood up. She didn't look at Vivian. She didn't acknowledge her existence. She simply turned and walked out of the dining room, cradling her bleeding hand against her chest, leaving a trail of crimson droplets on the hardwood floor. Vivian backed out of the room through the swinging servant doors, her knees shaking so badly she almost collapsed against the stainless steel counter. She set the wine bottle down. She looked at the door leading to the main hallway. Eleanor hadn't defended her. She had done something much more dangerous. She had hurt herself to distract her father. She had bled for her. Vivian closed her eyes, pressing her cold hands to her burning cheeks. The truce was over. They were no longer just a maid and a failing student. They were a liability to each other. Chained together in the dark, waiting for the floor to drop out from underneath them. Blood swirls perfectly with cold tap water. It creates a pale pink ribbon that spirals down the stainless steel drain of the kitchen's double basin. Vivian watched the pink ribbon, her hands trembling violently. She was pressing a wad of thick white gauze into the palm of Eleanor's right hand. They were alone in the industrial catering kitchen at the back of the estate. The air smelled of raw onions, bleached countertops, and the sharp metallic tang of copper. "Hold still," Vivian ordered, her voice a harsh, breathy whisper. Eleanor didn't move. She sat on a metal prep stool, her dress shirt ruined, her jacket discarded on the floor. Her chest was rising and falling in erratic, shallow jerks, the adrenaline still burning through her veins. She wasn't looking at her shredded palm. She was looking at Vivian. Vivian grabbed a bottle of iodine from the first aid kit on the counter. "This is going to burn." She poured it directly over the open lacerations. Eleanor's jaw locked. A sharp hiss escaped her teeth, her knuckles turning white as her left hand gripped the edge of the steel table. But she didn't pull away. She just kept her dark, heavy gaze anchored to Vivian's face. "You're a lunatic," Vivian said, taking a pair of sanitized tweezers and leaning over Eleanor's hand. Her fingers were slick with her blood. "You could have severed a tendon. You could have lost the use of your fingers." "I distracted him." Eleanor's voice was completely devoid of its usual arrogant armor. It was flat and hollow. "You terrified him. You terrified your father." Vivian dug the tweezers into a deep cut near Eleanor's thumb, pulling out a jagged quarter-inch shard of crystal. It clinked against the steel counter. "And you terrified me. I had to stop him." Eleanor shifted on the stool, closing the small distance between them. Her knees bracketed Vivian's hips. "If I let him humiliate you, he would have kept going. If I defended you with words, my father would have seen you as a piece on the board. You would have been leverage. You would have been dead." Vivian stopped digging for glass. She looked up. Eleanor's face was inches from hers. The mask of the untouchable alpha heir was entirely gone, stripped away by pain and pure, desperate honesty. She looked like a cornered animal who had just chewed off its own leg to escape a trap. She was shivering, the shock of the injury finally settling into her muscles. "You can't do things like this," Vivian whispered, the cynical, pragmatic shell she wore every day finally cracking down the middle. "You can't bleed for me, Eleanor." We don't live in a world where the boss's daughter bleeds for the maid. You're going to get us both killed. I'm already dead in this house. Eleanor raised her uninjured left hand. She didn't grab Vivian's arm or her shoulder, she gently, hesitantly cupped her jaw. Her thumb brushed over Vivian's cheekbone. Her skin was freezing cold. Every day I wake up in this place, I have to pretend I'm not drowning. I have to pretend I can read the ledgers. I have to pretend I don't feel sick when my father orders a hit. I have to pretend I'm a monster, or they'll eat me alive. Her voice cracked, entirely stripped of pride. You're the only thing in this entire God-forsaken estate that is real. Vivian's breath hitched. She should step back. She should drop the tweezers, walk out of the kitchen, and pack her bags. She didn't. Eleanor leaned down. It wasn't a smooth, practiced movement. It was clumsy and desperate. Her lips crashed into Vivian's. She tasted like expensive wine, stale adrenaline, and terror. Vivian let out a soft, involuntary gasp, her hands flying up to grip the lapels of Eleanor's ruined shirt. She didn't push her away. She pulled her in. Her fingers dug into the expensive, blood-soaked cotton. The kiss was messy, desperate, and entirely inappropriate. It was two people suffocating in the dark, violently sharing a single breath of air. Eleanor groaned, a low, guttural sound in the back of her throat. She wrapped her good arm tightly around Vivian's waist, pulling her flush against her chest, anchoring her against her as if she were the only solid object in a spinning room. The cold metal of the prep table dug into Vivian's spine, but she didn't care. She kissed Eleanor back with all the suppressed fear and exhaustion of the last month. Her hands tangled in her dark, messy hair. For 30 seconds, there was no Mafia. There was no final. There was no Carmine. Then the heavy hum of the commercial refrigerator kicked on with a deafening clunk. Vivian jerked back, gasping for air. Her lips were swollen. Her heart hammered against her ribs like a trapped bird. Eleanor kept her arms securely around Vivian's waist. Her forehead dropped to rest heavily against Vivian's. She was breathing just as hard, her eyes squeezed shut. Eleanor. Vivian's voice was shaking. She pressed her hands flat against Eleanor's chest, feeling the frantic, chaotic beat of her heart under the damp cotton. We can't. Dante knows something is wrong. If he digs, he'll find out about the studying. He'll find out about this. Let him dig. Eleanor's voice was a raw rasp. She opened her eyes. The vulnerability was slowly being replaced by a cold, hardened resolve. It was the same look she had right before she shattered the glass. I've spent 18 years being afraid of my own shadow in this family. I'm done. Vivian looked at Eleanor's bleeding hand. Then back to her eyes. She realized with a sickening drop in her stomach what she had done. She hadn't just taught Eleanor how to pass a chemistry test. She had taught her how to leverage her own strength. She had handed a loaded gun to an alpha who had spent her entire life being the target. Finish patching my hand, Eleanor commanded quietly, stepping back and resting her right arm on the table. The alpha air was back, but the deadness in her eyes was gone. Now there was a fire burning behind them. I have to go to my father's office. Why? Vivian grabbed a roll of medical tape, her hands shaking worse than before. Eleanor stared at the swinging doors of the kitchen. Because we have a final exam to pass. And the subject is supply and demand. Carmine Moretti's primary office smelled like old leather, cigar ash, and gunpowder. Vivian stood near the heavy oak doors, flanked by two massive alphas in dark suits. They had pulled her from the laundry room 10 minutes ago. Her mother was upstairs, completely oblivious. Vivian's gray uniform felt like a prison jumpsuit. Her throat was bone dry. At the center of the room, behind an immense desk, sat Carmine. To Carmine's right stood Dante. He was practically vibrating with smug, vicious triumph. He held a lit cigarette, completely ignoring the ash that fell onto the Persian rug. And directly in front of the desk, standing perfectly straight despite the thick white bandages wrapping her right hand, was Eleanor. On the polished mahogany of Carmine's desk lay the blue plastic ruler and a handful of red casino poker chips. Dante had tossed Eleanor's bedroom. He had found the tools. He had done the math. She's defective, Uncle Carmine. Dante's voice was slick with poison. He pointed a finger at Eleanor. She can't even read her own mail. She uses these little toys like a first grader. And worse, she's got the Omega maid doing her homework for her. She's a liability. You put her in the chair, the other families will laugh us out of Boston. Carmine didn't look at Dante. He stared at his daughter. His eyes were completely unreadable, two black holes absorbing all the light in the room. Is this true? Carmine asked. His voice wasn't a roar. It was a low, rumbling earthquake. Vivian braced herself against the wall. This was it. The floor was opening up. Eleanor was going to be exiled. And Vivian was going to be buried under the foundation of the house. Eleanor didn't flinch. She didn't look at Vivian. She kept her eyes locked on her father. I have a neurological processing delay, Eleanor said. Her voice was cool, level, and utterly devoid of shame. Letters transpose on a white background. It slows down my reading comprehension. Dante let out a sharp, barking laugh. She admits it. The heir is a goddamn cripple. Shut your mouth, Dante. Carmine's voice snapped, silencing the room instantly. Carmine leaned forward, resting his heavy forearms on the desk. He looked at the blue plastic. You're telling me you can't read the family ledgers, Eleanor? I'm telling you I read them differently. Eleanor stepped up to the desk. She reached out with her left hand, picked up the blue ruler and held it up to the light. I don't skim, Pop, because I can't. I have to look at every single number. I have to physically break down the math. Which is why I found the margin of error in the Southside shipping logs. Dante's arrogant smile instantly vanished. He stiffened, the cigarette freezing halfway to his mouth. Vivian's breath caught. She watched Eleanor's shoulders. The tension wasn't fear anymore. It was pure, coiled predatory energy. What margin of error? Carmine asked, his voice dropping an octave, instantly switching from father to mob boss. Eleanor reached into her inside jacket pocket with her left hand. She pulled out a folded piece of paper. Not a school exam, a Moretti family cargo ledger. She tossed it onto the desk. Dante has been skimming the tariffs off the import containers for 6 months. Eleanor's voice rang with cold authority. He hides it by inflating the domestic fuel costs on page 4 of the weekly report. Nobody caught it because everybody schemes the report. But I don't skim. I process it line by line. She paused, letting the weight of her words settle. He's stolen $300,000 from you since August. The silence in the office was deafening. It felt like all the oxygen had been sucked out through the air vents. Dante dropped his cigarette. It burned into the rug. She's lying, Uncle Carmine. She's a desperate idiot trying to cover her own ass. Quiet. Carmine's voice was absolute. He picked up the ledger. He didn't need the blue plastic. He read the numbers. He flipped the page. He traced a line with his thick, calloused finger. Vivian watched Carmine's face. She saw the exact moment the math clicked. The moment the boss realized he had been robbed by his own blood. Carmine slowly placed the paper down. He looked at Dante. "You brought me plastic toys," Carmine said softly, terrifyingly, "to distract me from stolen money, pup?" Dante stammered, backing away toward the door. "She fabricated it. She had the Omega do the math." "She's the one, the Omega," Eleanor interrupted, her voice finally rising, drowning out her cousin. "She taught me how to compensate for a biological flaw. She taught me how to weaponize my own focus. What she did built my value." Eleanor stepped forward, planting her hands on the desk, leaning directly into her father's space. She wasn't the failing student anymore. She was the heir taking the crown. "You want a ruthless successor, Pop?" Eleanor demanded, her gray eyes burning into Carmine's. "Then look at the board. Dante is a thief who relies on cheap gossip. I am the daughter who just recovered $350,000 and proved I don't miss a single detail in a ledger. I don't care if I have to read the documents through blue plastic. I read them better than anyone in this room." Carmine stared at his daughter. For 10 agonizing seconds, the mob boss simply observed the girl he thought was weak. He looked at the bloody bandages. He looked at the cold, unyielding fire in Eleanor's eyes. He looked at a predator who had finally learned how to hunt. Slowly, Carmine leaned back in his leather chair. A grim, terrifying smile spread across his face. "Take Dante to the warehouse," Carmine said quietly, not looking away from Eleanor. The 2 guards standing next to Vivian moved instantly. They grabbed Dante by the arms. "Uncle Carmine." "Wait. Wait." Dante screamed, thrashing wildly as they dragged him backward. His heels scraped against the hardwood. "Eleanor's a freak. You can't trust her. She's—" The heavy oak doors slammed shut, cutting off the screams. The room fell deadly silent again. Carmine picked up the blue plastic ruler. He studied it for a moment. Then he tossed it back across the desk toward Eleanor. "Next time you find a rat in my house," Carmine said, his voice returning to its casual, rumbling cadence, "you don't wait for him to bring me your school supplies. You handle it yourself. Understood?" "Understood," Eleanor said flatly. "Get out." Eleanor picked up the blue plastic. She turned around. She walked past the empty space where Dante had stood. And she walked straight toward Vivian. She didn't grab her. She didn't say a word. She just stopped in front of her, the massive oak doors behind her. She looked down at Vivian, her chest heaving, the adrenaline slowly ebbing away, leaving behind the exhausted, battered alpha Vivian knew in the dark. "Come on," Eleanor said softly. Her voice was meant only for Vivian. Vivian pushed off the wall. Her legs felt like lead. But she followed. They walked out of the office together, leaving the heavy scent of cigars and blood behind them. They didn't run away. They didn't pack bags and escape into the night like a fairy tale. That wasn't their world. Later that night, in the quiet, lemon-scented sanctuary of the third-floor library, Vivian sat behind the massive mahogany desk. She slid a stack of red poker chips across the wood. Eleanor sat across from her. She looked at the chips through the blue plastic overlay. Her bandaged hand rested on the textbook. They were trapped in a violent, unforgiving empire. But as Eleanor looked up from the page, her gray eyes meeting Vivian's with a quiet, unshakable certainty, Vivian realized something fundamental. Eleanor wasn't failing anymore. And neither was she. They were just writing their own rules. One red chip at a time. Did you hold your breath when Eleanor shattered the glass? That's the real cost of survival in the Moretti family. Eleanor and Vivian didn't run. They flipped the game. And they took the power.